outnumbered more than 2 to 1, the Almogavares were going to fight. They would show the world why their services were so highly valued. They would fight for the colors of Aragon for Roger, for Byzantium for God, but above all, they would fight for money. After a pleasant winter, in which the Almogavares had been able to rest, it was time to get back to work. Since there was no Turkish army nearby, the path was clear towards their next target, in Anatolia, Philadelphia. During the winter, the Aragonese had recruited reinforcement troops of around 500 Greeks and a strong mercenary company of Alans, about 4,000 men. But before they marched, something occurred. As I mentioned in the previous video, the Almogavares were causing a lot of problems for the civilian population, who were theoretically allies, and they were getting angry with the mercenaries. After a disagreement between Roger and one of his officers on how to respond to these problems, Arenos' troops left the mercenary company. But there's more. A few hours before breaking camp and starting the march to Philadelphia, would something similar happen as with the Genoese. Basically, it all started with a dispute between a handful of Alans and a handful of Almogavares over the order in which they would be attended by a Greek courtesan. There was a fight in which an Almogávar died, causing the rest of the Aragonese to flee. The matter seemed settled, but at night, hundreds of Almogavars charged against the Alan camp, leaving almost 500 Alans dead in their beds, their throats cut. The next morning, the Alans, to see what had happened, charged against the Almogavares, killing each other. In the end, the campaign started off poorly, and Roger de Flor chose to turn a blind eye so as not to punish his men or reprimand them for what had happened. Girgon, leader of the Aranos, who had lost his own son in the brawl, ordered to abandon the campaign and return to Atrasia. Well, in reality, only the infantry were leaving. The cavalry decided to stay with Roger. Now, on April 9th of the year 1304, the company left the isthmus where it was located. They totaled about 2,500 riders and nearly 5,000 infantrymen. They were accompanied by women, children, and slaves. For if they had left them at the camp, they would also have had to leave a strong garrison. They had made a risky decision. They wouldn't leave any garrison along the way. They wouldn't have a supply line to ensure provisions. They were playing the card of speed and surprise to defeat the Turks. Therefore, they would live off what they could get from the land, whether by buying, looting, or donations from civilians. On the 20th of April, the company arrived at Chiara, where the Greeks asked Roger to free various local populations, but the Megaduke refused. They couldn't divide the army, as they were already too few for the Turks to attack them separately. That's why they left no garrisons. There, in addition, they received news from the forces besieging Philadelphia. Apparently, they were two independent armies working together to take the city. Since they wanted it intact, they were not assaulting it. They intended to surrender it by hunger, and it had been a while. In addition, in recent days, they were moving the bulk of the army to a place called Aulax. According to the Greeks, this place was a day's march from Philadelphia. So they estimated that the Lads company would take about 10 to reach that point. And they were right. If the Almogavares were a normal army with supply lines and heavy equipment, however, the Almogavares could cover that distance. In half the time, the Almogavares began the march. And while they head to Aulax, I invite you to subscribe to the channel, to give it a like, and to become a member to access exclusive videos. Indeed, before all the Turkish forces were grouped in Aulax, at dawn, the Almogavares appeared on the battlefield. Look at the stage. It's a wasteland, a bare plain. There are no trees, no rivers, no houses, there's nothing. It's something ideal for the cavalry. Imagine how much the Castilian heavy cavalry would enjoy here. And what were the forces of each side like? The Turkish troops had 12,000 infantrymen and 8,000 horsemen, distributed in two groups. On one side all the cavalry and on the other the infantry. However, in front of the infantry there was a contingent of fearsome archers who could decimate the Almogavares during the charge. The Aragonese company, for its part, also formed with the infantry, on one side facing the enemy and the cavalry on the other also facing the enemy. The cavalry had the heavy ones at the front, formed by Aragonese, Catalans and Valencians, where he himself was, and behind the light cavalry, mainly formed by Greeks and Alans. The infantry was distributed in three lines. The first two were Almogavares, the third Greek. The intention was for the first two to break the front, while the Greeks would take care of finishing off the wounded. Would they leave no survivors? It was the moment. Roger de Flor whispered a prayer to St. George and launched his battle cry Desperta Ferro. The cry was seconded by thousands of throats, and quickly the army of Unison began to advance slowly. The battle would surely drag on. They needed to conserve energy. The Turks began to beat their war drums. The archers placed the arrows in their bows and waited for the distance to shorten. When the Almogavares came within range of their arrows, they tightened their bows, aimed at the sky, and let their arrows fly. But then the Aragonese officers ordered the charge, and the Mercenaries broke into a run. Shortly after, a rain of arrows fell behind them, causing no casualties, but they could only avoid the first discharge. They raised their shields, and then the new salvos of arrows began to rattle on them, some hitting flesh and tearing out cries of pain. But most bounced off the helmets or stuck into the shields without causing damage. As the Almogavares shortened distances, the cavalry overtook them and hit the Turkish, who in turn carried out a countercharge. The Turks skillfully handled their scimitars, but on horseback, the Almogavares preferred the heavy Castilian swords, which, against the weak Turkish armor, wreaked havoc. The Turkish cavalry was falling at a much faster rate than the Almogavares. At that moment, the archers turned around and fled, behind their infantry, which formed a wall of shields ready to resist the enemy onslaught. The Almogavares threw themselves like beasts against the enemy shields. They thrust their weapons into any gap in the front and stabbed or cut any piece of flesh that was left unprotected. Some, taking advantage of their lightness, ducked below the shield line and slashed at the Turkish legs, trying to sneak under the front. The Turks had not faced each other in the open field. To an enemy so determined to win, an enemy who despised his own life, an enemy who left no survivors. The dead fell on both sides, watering the lands of Anatolia with Christian and Muslim blood. The hours passed and men kept dying. After midday, the Emir Yakut, who was the leader of the two Turkish armies, came within stone's throw. There was no time to lose. A handful of Almogavar riders formed a wedge in the middle of the battle and galloped forward, slashing their way through the enemy hordes. One thing was clear to them: cut off the head of the snake and the army will disintegrate. The Turks tried to stop them, but they were struck down by Christian fury. A rider struck the Emir's shoulder, unseating him. The Emir was lost amidst the enemy horses. But they had to make sure he was really dead. Roger de Flor, realizing what was happening, encouraged his men to press through the small gap that the wedge had opened, to finish off the Emir. However, the Turks were not fools, and they rushed in droves to protect the Emir. Soon they put him on a horse, and with a strong escort, the Emir left the battle and fled. This escape shattered Turkish morale. The Muslim riders fought with less vigor and allowed the Almogávares to gain ground in the center. On their part, the Turkish infantry was retreating, trying to form an impenetrable wall, but they were not succeeding. More and more Muslim foot soldiers continued to fall before the Aragonese still. The Greeks, from behind, finished off the Turks who had not died. They executed the wounded who could not escape. The Almogava infantry was like a shredder that destroyed the enemy front and left not a single survivor in its wake. The Turks tried to surround the Almogavars by sending part of the reserve to the flank, but part of the second line was sent to stop the encirclement. What seemed like an easy victory for the Turks was turning into hell on earth. Then something broke, something clicked in the Muslim minds. The center of the Turkish cavalry line broke and the first Almogavares reached the enemy rear and quickly surrounded the Turkish cavalry. No one withstands an attack from behind. The Turkish mounted troops abandoned all cohesion and were only concerned for their own lives, trying to escape the slaughter. When the rear infantry realized that the cavalry was leaving the battlefield, they decided they didn't want to be the fools. To die fighting for a lost cause, they turned around and fled, abandoning the vanguard. When they realized it, they also started to flee. But remember, the Almogavares were much lighter than the Turks and therefore faster. In the pursuit that followed the battle, the Almogavares killed hundreds to thousands of terrified Turks from behind, from Aulax. When they took the casualty count, the result left Roger de Flor astonished. 6,000 Turkish horsemen and 10,000 infantrymen had died that day, leaving only 2,000 survivors. On their part, the Almogavares had lost less than 200 men. Okay, now you're going to allow me to make a reflection here. Firstly, the battle. According to Ramon Muntaner, the battle happened like this. While in the Byzantine Chronicle, the Turks fled without presenting a battle. Given the Turks' numerical advantage, it's unlikely they would leave without fighting. So it is most likely that Ramon Muntaner is right, and the battle took place like this. Now, the casualties? I highly doubt that 16,000 Turks fell in exchange for only 200 Almogavares. We're talking about 80 Turks dying for every dead Almogavar. That seems exaggerated. I don't doubt that the mercenaries were better than the Turks, but this is an implausible extreme. Let's take the Battle of Cannae as an example. There the Romans were completely surrounded, a much more favorable position for the Carthaginians than that of the Almogavares charging head-on. There about 70,000 Romans died or were captured, 70,000, while about 6,000 or 7,000 Carthaginians fell. That is, one Carthaginian dead for every 10 or 12 Romans. What I mean is that it is very likely that Ramon Muntaner, who has been said to be everything, was part of the company itself. Almogava may have embellished the figures to praise the Almogavares. My recommendation, as always but especially here, take the figures with a grain of salt. What is certain is that the Turks were devastated. The Almogavares, after thoroughly looting the corpses, set up their camp to rest and recover from the battle. In addition, Roger de Flor sent various parties of light cavalry to see if Philadelphia was saved. And indeed, the Turks had abandoned the city as well as the surrounding towns that were occupied. The Muslim troops were fleeing to the east. Shortly after, the Almogavares triumphantly entered Philadelphia as liberators, as heroes, and the Greeks received them with unusual joy. They had been under Turkish siege for 2 years and now they were finally free. But the joy was short-lived. Roger de Flor presented a bill to the city governor wanting to charge for their liberation. Of course, the governor, astonished, told him that if they worked for the emperor and it was he who paid them, Philadelphia owed them nothing. But let's say that Roger forced the governor to quote-unquote see reason, and he gathered the little money that was left in the city and handed it over to the Almogavares. And why not? Just like what happened in Sicily, in Constantinople, and in the Artaki Peninsula, the Almogavares began to cause problems among the civilian population. Therefore, after 2 weeks of arriving in Philadelphia, the company left for Magnesia. But we'll leave this for the next chapter.